A new era for BRICS nations. The 5 members of the Bloc have agreed to invite 6 new ones, and they're planning new currency arrangements aimed at reducing reliance on the US dollar. So can BRICS really shake up the world's political and economic architecture? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. At a summit in Johannesburg, the BRICS alliance has agreed to expand from 5 members to 11 by the start of next year. There might be more strength in numbers, but it's also part of a drive to reduce reliance on the US dollar for trade in a world more polarised than any time since the Cold War. So what will its expansion mean? Well, the BRICS club is comprised of 5 major emerging economies, those of China, Brazil, South Africa, Russia and India. But is looking to more than double its membership, with 6 nations invited to join in 4 months' time. They include Argentina, that has vast natural resources, but also economic turmoil. Then there is the Arab world's largest economy, Saudi Arabia, and Africa's second most populous country, Ethiopia. It's got close ties with Russia and China, but also the United States. The others are Iran, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates. There was plenty more under discussion too. The new development bank based in Shanghai plans to lend using the currencies of BRICS members. More cooperation with African nations has also been promised.
China will launch the initiative on supporting Africa's industrialization. China will better harness its resources for cooperation with Africa, an initiative of businesses to support Africa in growing its manufacturing sector and realizing industrialization and economic diversification.
Our relationship with China will be one of promoting win-win outcomes, based also on an important project that we have initiated, which is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is going to be the engine of our economic development.
Well, attending remotely was Russia's President Vladimir Putin. He's wanted by the International Criminal Court for alleged war crimes in Ukraine. Speaking from Moscow, he also promised economic support for Africa.
Right now, we're concluding negotiations with various African countries on these issues. We're doing so despite the obstacles created by others, in particular illegitimate sanctions imposed against our exports, which complicate insurance and settlement. Our African friends can rest assured that Russia will always remain a reliable food supply and continue to support the countries most in need.
Well, other leaders brought up issues ranging from the future of BRICS to pushing for solutions to equality and poverty.
The expansion and modernization of BRICS is a message that all the global institutions must be adapted to the changing times. This initiative can be an example for the reform of other 20th century global institutions.
The energy transition cannot replicate the exploitation relationship of the colonial past. We need solutions that diversify and add value to the production of developing countries. The most evident signal that the planet is becoming a place of more inequality is the growth of hunger and poverty.
All right, let's bring in our guests now. From Berlin, we have Ben Aris, who's the founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews, a business media company focusing on emerging markets. From Johannesburg, Arina Muresan, a senior researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue and a South African foreign policy specialist. And from Beijing, Einar Tangen, China affairs analyst and senior fellow at the Taihe Institute. A warm welcome to all of you. Ben Aris, if I may start with you. So BRICS is here, bigger and better than before, you might say. A force for the good, you'd say?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think what's going on is very historic in so much as their view of the BRICS themselves is that, you know, we've been emerging markets, we've been struggling with poverty, with getting basic things in place. And this has all been happening in the last 30 years since the socialist experiment ended, failed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. and everybody's embraced markets. So the ideology, we're now on the same page, and that you had 3 billion people in the West, the capitalist system, and they've been joined by 3 billion from the socialist system. And after 30 years, these emerging markets are beginning to emerge, and they're now reaching out and starting to say, look, we want our place at the top table. We want to have more of a say in the way the world is run. We want our interests represented, because they're underrepresented. They're underrepresented in things like the UN Security Council, in the various international bodies. And so what they're doing now is clubbing together in order to represent their interests and come as a body to what they see as the unipolar world that run by the West, specifically the US. And that's created various tensions, but there's also many divisions within the BRICS themselves. Some of them want to cooperate and see it as an economic club. Some of them, like China and Russia specifically, want to challenge the West and be a lot more aggressive. And within the group itself, there's a lot of dissent about how that should be done.
Right, we'll come on to those divisions in a moment or two. But first, Arina, speaking from Johannesburg, for a country like South Africa, what's wrong with the way things work right now? What's wrong with the status quo and Western institutions like the IMF and the World Bank?
Look, when you think about why the BRICS came together, they say that their voices were not heard across, the global economic platforms and the infrastructure already available. And for a country like South Africa that feels how currencies move immensely, this has immense potential to make a difference. But at the same time, while the BRICS are able to come together and strive for, some kind of equitable world order, it's important to remember that while the BRICS want to strive for a more equitable world order as a grouping, they are first and foremost acting in their national interest and muddling through, very uncertain global realities. Now, for South Africa, it's about how well it's able to domesticate this kind of BRICS agenda. What is it able to do with it in terms of taking these declarations, taking these bilateral relationships and making the best out of it? And from here, we've seen, 2 very key elements, expansion. The last time BRICS expanded, it was in 2010 with South Africa being included, and the alternative payment systems, as Cyril Ramaphosa gave marching orders to look at what can be done and, how can you look at potentially moving towards using the dollar a lot less, but creating more infrastructure for more local currencies.
Okay, again, we'll come on to that. Einar Tangen in Beijing. So BRICS is not competing with anyone, said Vladimir Putin, president of Russia. But that's not the case, is it? Isn't this all about putting BRICS Plus at the center of world affairs, creating a new world economic order?
Well, not exactly. I mean, let's go back a ways and talk about the G7, G8, whatever it was called back then. Those are supposed to be the leading nations. They were supposed to be guiding the world order and economically, et cetera. And then they were not useful during the economic crisis, the financial crisis, in 2008 and 2009. So you had the emergence of the G20, basically to do exactly what the G8, G7, and G8 at that time could not do. And then flash forward, what you have is a group of middle powers who've been, in essence, denied access to any kind of the kind of economic and political power that they feel that they deserve. And there's a huge vacuum. The G20, G7 have not been able to come forward. They were not very helpful when it came to the COVID, and they're certainly not being very helpful when it comes to the economic problems that we have here. So, the BRICS is a natural outcropping of countries that are united in the sense that they were all victimized by colonialization. And if you start adding them up, it's interesting. If you take the global South and then also the Central Asia, you have about 160 countries. Well, what do they have? They have the majority of the world's resources, and they have markets and they have production. And the question then becomes, if they come together and they start doing what you had happened with OPEC, they could, instead of asking for hundreds of billions of dollars to deal with climate change and start demanding that they get fair price for their natural resources and for the production.
Interesting. Ben, what do you make of that? And also this point, the fact that you have China and Russia at loggerheads, rising tensions with the United States and the West. And now BRICS is to add countries to its team that are openly antagonistic to the West, like Iran. This is just basically becoming an anti-Western bloc, isn't it?
Not yet, not yet. I mean, that's the process they've just started on, is they're trying to work out some modus operandi. Because, China, Russia, they need India, Brazil, South Africa, less so, but also on board. And Brazil and India have made it very clear that they don't want to have confrontation with the West, in so much as they have relations, good relations, and investment and what have you. And so they've got to find out within themselves how they're going to work this. And they were just at the beginning of the process. I mean, we just had like a first serious discussion. But nevertheless, people were lobbying. Russia was pushing for Iran to be included. Brazil was pushing for Argentina to be included. And they're going to have this disparate group. But yes, I mean, it is, I think, inevitable that they're going to clash with the West to some extent. And as my colleague just pointed out, a lot of people have said, look, this group's not going to work because they don't have enough in common, ideologically or system-wise. But it's not about what they have in common, it's about what they control. And between them, Central Asia, they control the addition of Saudi Arabia was particularly significant because now the BRICS Plus control 42% of the world's oil production. And they were already cooperating in a commercial sense with OPEC Plus, but now they're cooperating on a political level. And Russia itself controls, huge amounts of raw materials, metals, minerals. China also controls huge amounts of process, rare earths, and things like the electric vehicle revolution can't happen if China starts to hold those things back. And so the potential for a really nasty clash is there. But I think everybody's sort of, edging their way forward, trying to find out how this is going to work. And I think people like the States are going to be caught up short and going to have to make some sort of compromises. And we're in a new, undefined era as the emerging world emerges and starts to demand things, starts to ask for its voice to be heard. And either the West is going to take that into account, and this could go smoothly, or it's not, and then it could get ugly.
Right. As far as BRICS internally, or BRICS Plus internally is concerned, Arina, how will they avoid those clashes that Ben alludes to when you've got countries with very different economies and very different foreign policy objectives? How can they be cohesive in a way forward?
Look, many have come to say that this move to include these countries at the moment actually dilutes the power of BRICS politically because it's difficult to reach the consensus. At the moment, it seems that most of the geographic activity is slow to encapsulate, the full potential of South America, and perhaps this could be the future strategy to look at another phase of expansion. But if you look at the clustering right now, Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, this gives BRICS a kind of strategic Middle East, North Africa look, while these countries come with significant challenges of their own. Like we're saying, Egypt and Ethiopia are at an impasse regarding the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam. China's done a lot of heavy lifting in terms of Saudi Arabia and Iran to broker some kind of reconciliation. But this does not erase, years of competing foreign policies between Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran in the region. Even Argentina and Iranian relations have been immensely tense. But bringing in one or two without the other isolates another or the other, potentially pushing them to take destabilizing decisions for the region, if you so will. From one perspective, the BRICS could be moving to have a stronger economic impetus. But what if, or does this show a strategic decision to shift attention away from the Indo-Pacific, for example, as an anticipated theater of play, at least for the next few years to come? And you saw, the proposition of Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, where some have intimated that they're needed more time to understand, the ASEAN implications and impacts, creating some kind of BRICS Indo-Pacific anchor. But shifting attention back to the Middle East from the Indo-Pacific, does this contain, the military-industrial complex in that region while tapping into critical minerals and creating new markets?
Einar Tangen, you mentioned climate change. This is a very good example of the potential for differences. On the face of it, we have different priorities with, say, Brazil and with China. Brazil, we're under President Lula very much pro-environment and prioritizing environmental issues. China still emitting on a huge scale. Is that going to be a stumbling block, or conversely, might it make China more conducive to play ball, not being hectored by the West?
I don't understand why you say that China is behind the wall. I mean, there's a lot of things. For instance, there's always this thing that China's building coal plants. Well, what they actually do is they'll close down 30 or 40 coal plants, and they'll build one that is much more efficient and less polluting. They're doing this as a stopgap. They have plans, and as we know, China generally tends to meet any kind of deadlines that they set for themselves. So I wouldn't be worried about that. Also, China is the leader in the electric car industry, also photovoltaics and wind energy. So they're going along in their same line. This idea that they're somehow at loggerheads, I think, is wrong.
All right, let me put it a different way then, Einar. Perhaps can BRICS Plus be a force for good in the fight against climate change then?
Yeah, it can, but here's the problem. The BRICS cannot have everybody join. And the reason is, as my colleague said, you dilute the decision-making power. But I do think as a middle power representing these different regions, they can go back to the G7, who have not come forward with their promises. There was a promise of $100 billion a year. This was supposed to expand over many years. Only 10% of it has been delivered. And of that 10%, guess what? Most of the projects somehow benefit developed countries. And it's dubious as whether they're actually going to produce any kind of real environmental effect. So with a different entity representing these regions, they can go back and say, look, you folks have to, pony up. Because right now, there's nobody to hold the developed world accountable. Think about it. You can't go to the United Nations. You can't go anywhere. So right now, the BRICS is the best chance of getting some sort of real environmental action because they have leverage. And this is the only thing that is respected, despite all the high-sounding rhetoric about how we believe in the rule of law and international order. The fact is, the West, especially the U.S., lately has been running roughshod over everybody, starting wars, breaking treaties. It just goes on, undermining international institutions like the WTO by refusing to appoint appellate judges. So I do think that it can be a force for good. I don't see it as ideological. There's too many differences, but I do see it as a grouping. Remember, they do have something in common. Every single one of these nations was victimized by colonialization at one point or another. So it's a completely different grouping.
All right, that brings me on to my next point, because let me take you back to the 1950s. The original non-aligned movement was set up. Presidents Nasser of Egypt, President Tito of then Yugoslavia, and President Nero of India. It was quite successful, wasn't it? But then it turned back to the West in the 1980s. Are there lessons to be learned from that, Ben?
I mean, it was the first attempt, but I mean, things have changed dramatically this time round, in so much as the non-aligned in those days, they were relatively weak, and, sort of empires were at the height of their power. And what's changed now is that the whole balance has shifted towards emerging markets. And it's a derogatory term in a way. However, that's 40% of the world's population, and on 25% in terms of GDP nominal. But if you look at it at PPP, the parity purchasing power, then the emerging world is now richer than the developed world. And I think that's their point, is that, look, we're actually starting to be in charge. And I agree, I think we all agree that there's nothing ideological uniting these countries. I think the glue that's holding them together is a sort of enemy at the gates mentality of, like, we're being ignored by the rest of the world and we shouldn't be. And I think the way this is going to work is that they're going to be pragmatic. As emerging markets, they're dealing with lots of problems. And it's not a question of values or ideology or philosophy. It's simply, we've got things to fix. They're pointing, for example, at the currency, at the dollar's use, the domination of the dollar in the world trading system, which was a result of Bretton Woods. And they're very unhappy with that because that gives the states enormous amounts of power. And Russia in particular is the case in point, in so much as suddenly it had half its reserves confiscated and it's been banned from the financial system, and that's caused a huge problem. And Iran, same problem, and China's looking at that, India's looking at that, and they're very worried. And this is where the enemy at the gate thing comes from. Russia's already in conflict with the states, as is Iran. But India, China, South Africa, the other emerging markets are like, well, we're going to have a run-in with the states at some point. And then will they do the same to us? Confiscate our hard currency reserves, collapse our economies. I mean, Russia is strong enough, autocratic enough so that it can survive this, but smaller countries can't. And this is, I think, another reason why they're all running to the emerging world or the global south is running to this BRIC organization, because they need some support. They need someone to stand up to the West and represent their interests. And as my colleague said, there's nowhere else to go. The UN is dominated by the Security Council. That can't get you anywhere. There's no international court you can turn to. And so the BRICS is the alternative pole. And it's attracting a lot of interest because of that.
Einar, tell us about the new development bank and this issue that Ben is talking about here, de-dollarization, and the plans to lend using the home country's currency of BRICS members.
Well, it's not theoretical anymore. I mean, just before the meeting, they floated Rand bonds. So what this does is, by putting bonds out in Rand, that means they'll be repaid in Rand, which means that it takes an enormous amount of pressure off the country in question, because they don't have to worry about, what's going to happen to the dollar. That adds something. Now, of course, if you're investing money from outside of South Africa and you're buying Rand bonds, you do have to worry about it. But it transfers the risk to those who are more capable of doing it. Investors can hedge their position. They can make decisions, whereas people who are trying to get money are generally in the lesser position because they have to take whatever comes. The fact that the Rand bonds were oversubscribed by many, many times, and they hit and went above their target, bodes very well. But there's going to have to be more than just one bond rating, one bond issuance. They're going to have markets that can handle this. Obviously, within this grouping, you have UAE, which is, would be happy to garner some of that business. Obviously, China can do part of it. But, there's a long way to go before there's de-dollarization and everything like that. That's a little far off. But this whole issue about hedging, about having more money directly, especially between countries that are trading. Why should they be using dollars when they can trade directly in their currencies to the value of the trade that they have? So there's a lot of de-risking going on, and that's the correct term, de-risking. It's a financial term. It was never meant to be a political term.
Okay. So Arina, this is more about finding an alternative to the system rather than an alternative to the dollar.
Well, it's called de-dollarization. It's really about creating more trust in local currencies. And in the immediate sense, it is coming down to business. As we're saying, the dollar has been used extensively over decades. So there's liquidity, security, reusability that's very much attached to it. And traders want to make sure they receive the value they bargained for. That's why there's such, trust still placed in this, and why it's expected to take a little bit longer to achieve it. But that's not to say that cross-border payment systems are already in place and banks are already working with them. The BRICS started this interbank cooperation mechanism in 2010, and what they did was they created a lot of investing in regional financial services. They leapfrog technology. So you see a lot of low-hanging fruits, as the BRICS leaders would call them, reaching for those kind of low-hanging fruits, and it's building a lot of relationships between banks. If I can draw this back to how South Africa was engaging the Continental Free Trade Area specifically, which was part of the BRICS summit this year, this comes back to creating institutions as well, where Africans can benefit from. And in relating payments in local currencies and building this up, you have the Pan-African Payment Settlement System. And from that, they really want to create markets in addition that can flourish from these local currencies.
Okay.
So
I'm just going to jump in there. I'm sorry to jump in. We're just coming to the end of the program. Ben,
Sure.
I just want to give you the last word. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was in Johannesburg. He echoed the BRICS long-standing calls for reform of the UN Security Council, of the IMF and the World Bank. Is that going to happen anytime soon, do you think? Briefly, if you would.
I don't think so. It's going to be too difficult. I mean, the permanent members on the Security Council are quite happy with that, although someone like China and Russia are lobbying. There's no representative from Africa. There's one from Asia. There's 3 from Europe. And the others are going to resist that because they don't want to upset the balance of power, which is, again, very much skewed towards the West. And with the other institutions, I mean, that's going on. I think that's happening slowly, that China is busy rallying people in the General Assembly, and they're building up a voting bloc. So I think with the bodies themselves, we could see other people being appointed. But then it's a long, slow process. I think this whole thing with the rise of the BRICS, we're right at the very beginning of what will take decades to happen. But again, I think it's inevitable, given the size of these markets, the speed they're growing, and the importance of the global economy, so that it's not to be resisted. It's just a question of how this process works, either smoothly or in a less smooth way where people start fighting with each other.
All right. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you to all our guests, to Ben Aris, Arina Muresan and Einar Tangen. Thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, it's goodbye for now.